We know the fact that if two devices needs to talk to each other, they need IP addresses, and you assign IP addresses to the resources. In Azure, it is no different. So you can assign IP addresses to Azure resources to communicate with other Azure resources. And that could be your on-premise network or the internet. So there are two types of IP addresses that we're talking about. In your virtual network, when you have an Azure resource, you can contain both public and private IP addresses. The private IP addresses are used for communication within the Azure virtual network. So if there are virtual machines and databases in your virtual network that need to talk to each other, they will use a private IP. You will also use a private IP address if you have extended your network and connected your on-premise infrastructure with your VNet. So you will use private IP addresses for communication with the resources in your VNet to the resources in your premise. To connect your on-premise network to Azure network, you will need something called as a VPN gateway or express route. And these are used to extend your network to Azure. Public IP addresses, on the other hand, are used for communication with the internet, as the name says, public. So if there is any public facing entity or public facing endpoint, then you will need a public IP address assigned to your virtual machine or the Azure resource. IP addresses can either have a static assignment or a dynamic assignment. Static IP addresses do not change and are best for certain scenarios such as DNS name resolution, where a change in IP address would require updating host records. It's also good for IP address based security models, which requires apps or services to have a static IP address. SSL certificates are always linked to an IP address. Firewall rules that allow or deny traffic based on IP address ranges. Role-based virtual machines such as domain controllers and DNS servers. So critical servers will always have a static assignment of IP address. As a best practice, you may decide to separate dynamic assignment with static assignment. Organizations usually have a dynamic assignment into a particular subnet, and a static assignment goes to a different subnet. So all the devices that have a dynamic IP address will go into one subnet. All the devices that have static IP addresses will go into a separate subnet. And IP addresses are never managed from within a virtual machine. Remember this, please. If you want to change the IP address assignment from static to dynamic, never go to the network card properties and change that radio button. Let's never do that, because there have been several scenarios where this mechanism of changing static to dynamic is not supported. If you would ever like to do it, you always do it from the Azure portal or PowerShell. So remember that IP address management is not done from within the virtual machine. It is done from the Azure portal.